Hi there, and welcome. I'm Thomas Canavan, the Chief Operating Officer of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund and the Executive Director of the National Law Enforcement Museum. I'm so glad that you're joining us for this special five-part series, Law Enforcement Think Tanks, Shaping the Future of Policing. In these episodes, we'll hear from incredible leaders working behind the scenes to improve law enforcement in ways that we don't often hear about. For many of us, it might seem like policing has always been the way that it is today, but that's far from the truth. What we learn in movies, TV shows, music, and the media rarely captures the full picture. In reality, dozens of organizations, led by law enforcement, policy, criminal justice, and public safety experts, are constantly shaping and improving the profession. In this series, we'll introduce you to five of these organizations and the leaders behind them. Chris Shung, Executive Director of The Curve, Paul Goldenberg, Senior Fellow at the Miller Center for Policing and Community Resilience at Rutgers University, Ben Heyman, Executive Director of the Center for Public Safety and Justice at the University of Virginia, Jim Bierman, founder of the Future Policing Institute, and Rosa Brooks, co-director of the Center on Innovations in Community Safety at Georgetown University. Each guest brings a unique perspective and decades of experience. Their stories will challenge assumptions, spark new ideas, and highlight the work being done to keep communities safe. Each of our guests' bios and links to their organizations can be found in the episode descriptions. Also, we recorded one introduction for the whole series, so when you start the next episode, you can skip directly to where our conversation begins. Thank you again for joining us today, and enjoy the conversations. Well, hello, Rosa. Thank you for joining us today on this podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're going to walk through a little bit of your background, give listeners an idea of who you are and what you studied and how you came to be at Georgetown University. And so I wanted to start with just a little bit of your background in high school, college. I know that you went to Harvard at a young age. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what you did at Harvard?
Oh gosh, I was young, so I didn't know what I was doing, and it was a little bit intimidating because I just turned 17, and there were all these kids who'd gone to these fancy prep schools, and I went to public school and had never really been around all these people who came from these much wealthier families, and had gone to Exeter and Andover and Groton and all these places. So it was pretty intimidating at first. I actually did flailed around for a little while, like a lot of kids do in college, I think, just trying to figure out what I was interested in, and I ended up studying history and literature, basically with a pretty heavy emphasis on taking a lot of English classes. Um, and I loved that part of it. And I had some great professors, but there's an irony about Harvard. I don't know if this is true at other schools like that, but at Harvard, the hardest thing was getting in. And once you were in, it was pretty much impossible to flunk. It's like you could do almost nothing and you'd get a B. You had to work pretty hard to get an A, but you could just coast and get Bs. And I probably, like a lot of students, that I love the extracurriculars more than I love the classes. So my big activity, I ended up becoming the president of the undergraduate public service organization at Harvard, which, big organization, did everything from, summer tutoring programs for kids in inner city Boston to advocacy for recent immigrants, et cetera. And that was the thing. I pretty much lived. It was called Phillips Brooks House Association, and I pretty much lived there. And luckily for me, you could kind of get away with doing that. The way that academic calendar was structured, you had this long 2-week reading period before exams. And a lot of my classes, you didn't have to do anything until the finals. So I would sort of do nothing, 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 nothing. And then I'd have this panicky 2 weeks of desperate cramming, and would take the exam or write the paper and manage to skate through somehow. But so it was a strange place. Nobody likes Harvard. I've literally never met anybody. When you say to people who went to Harvard, like, oh, did you like it? They're like, it's not a school that's warm and fuzzy. It's not a school that people come out and they're like, I just loved it. Happiest years of my life. Kind of at best, everybody's like, but I met interesting people. I learned a little bit along the way. So overall, I feel pretty lucky.
And what was your undergraduate degree in? Was it
History and
history?
literature,
Ah,
yeah.
okay.
Eng-
Yeah.
Eng- yeah, English and
Are you
American history and
are you
lit.
from the New England area?
I grew up in New York and a little bit Connecticut. So sort of.
Hmm. Yeah. And then after Harvard, you went to Oxford,
Mhm.
another elite university.
I did. I think I had a whole bunch of chips on my shoulder, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think partly because I was so young. I was a little young for my whatever grade.
Mhm.
And partly because I was surrounded by all these kids with these, super rich kids with who
Mhm.
went to fancy schools, and I had a little bit of like, I'm going to show you. Um,
Mhm.
um, and so uh, for me, probably there was probably a little too much of just doing stuff because I felt like I had something to prove. I had to prove I was just as smart and just as able to do these things. And Oxford, it's very beautiful. It's kind of the best thing I can say about it. My first year I was doing, somehow I got talked into signing up for a master's degree in European politics, which I couldn't understand. It was all about the European Union. I had no background in it. I was totally over my head and really boring. And I had a little bit of a crisis of like, what am I doing here? I don't, and I ended up changing degree programs and switching to an anthropology degree. And that was great. That actually, in some ways, ended up being really much more influential in terms of my future and how I thought about the world. And I kind of lucked out. I had this great tutor. You get assigned somebody who's sort of like your primary academic advisor and professor. And he was the guy who was also the chair of the department, who just was this fantastic guy. He would sit there whenever I met with him. He smoked a pipe. He was this classic English Oxford professor, tweed jacket, pipe smoking. He had this kind of recliner chair, and he'd sort of start out semi sitting normally. And by the end of the session, he'd be practically horizontal. He'd kind of gradually sort of slump down and lean back. And so just a little bit of pipe smoke would be kind of curling up from where he sat in this chair. But he was just really smart, really interesting. And it was, for me, and this actually ends up probably being related to why I eventually became a reserve police officer and wrote about it. And what anthropologists do is they go into other cultures and they immerse themselves in them and just try to really, it's called participant observation, that you're not standing on the outside looking in. You go and you just be part of a culture, but you're also interested in trying to understand it better. And so I read, the sort of classic 19th century British anthropologist who was all sort of, so and so goes to the Borneo or whatever, or
Mhm.
this exotic tribe in wherever. And of course, to the Brits in 19th century, like basically everything was exotic. Like France was really exotic. Everything that wasn't England was extremely exotic to them. Um, but I read all this classic anthropology work, and kind of caught the bug, just sort of thinking, wow, because once you start thinking as an anthropologist and you start thinking about the sort of the rituals and the norms and the assumptions that every culture has that often they never articulate, um, then you start turning that lens on yourself and your own culture and sort of thinking, okay, what are the things that we do that somebody from Mars, an anthropologist from Mars would come down and say, holy cow, these people have this weird ritual, like, whatever it is. I mean, it's like we go to the airport and we take our shoes off. They're like, they must
Right.
be placating the gods when they do
Right.
that. These things that you just take for granted, but you realize this is kind of strange. It's every
Yeah.
bit as strange as, the whoever is of Borneo, burning icons or something.
Right. Do you think that the chip that you described, do you think that pushed you farther than you would have?
Oh yeah. Oh sure. No, I definitely had a lot that I wanted to prove. I wanted to prove I was, smart enough and good enough, and of course I had other chips on my shoulder too, I suppose, and that's probably, becoming a reserve police officer was like, and I'm tough enough too.
Right. 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 Yeah.
uh, I probably read too much, too many thrillers as a kid or something, and too many mysteries.
Yeah. No, I think sometimes those chips serve us well.
For sure, for sure. Yep.
How did so then after Oxford you went to Yale? Was that directly after Oxford?
Yes, I went to law school, and there too, I didn't, none of this was a plan. This is something I'm always struggling to explain to my own students who always say things like, well, if I want, like, how do I end up where you are? If I want to end up here in 10 years, what do I do? And I always think, oh, that's just not how it works. You kind
Yeah.
of muddle along and you do one thing and then you do another, and then you wake up one day and you're in a particular place and you can kind of pretend it was all part of a plan, but usually it's pretty random. So there I was at Oxford doing this anthropology master's degree. I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I had managed to sort of delay having to decide by staying in school. But now I was like, uh-oh, I'm gonna have to come up with something. I still couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. I applied to two law schools, a public health school, an anthropology PhD program, an English PhD program, and a business school. Oh, and
Hmm.
a master's in public policy, I think, too. So I had no idea. Um, but my boyfriend at the time was planning to go to law school. And so were a lot of my friends. My American friends who were at Oxford were planning to go home and go to law school. And so I got into law school and still wasn't sure what to do, but my boyfriend decided he got into Yale Law School and he decided he was going to go to Yale Law School. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to go to Yale Law School because that's where my boyfriend is going. And that is why I went to law school.
Yeah. Wow. Well, whatever it is that drives us there, it's where
Nothing
we
but
end
bad
up.
reasons.
Yeah. What so and in your experience in law school, was there any particular aspect of the legal field that interests you?
Yeah, I thought law school would be boring and it ended up being really fun and interesting. I mean, I just didn't know anything about it. I thought you take these classes with names like torts and contracts and property, and it just sounded kind of deadly.
Hmm.
But what I discovered, and I think a lot of, I think law students are always surprised by this. Most law students actually tend to like law school more than they thought. It's all about these stories, that what you do in your first year, you read these cases, and the cases, of course, involve, two people or two groups of people having some conflict. And often the stories that lead to the conflict are just totally wild, this sort of bizarre series of events. And then some court has to decide like who's right, who's wrong, who's liable, or does somebody go to jail or not? And I just found it much more interesting than I expected. I ended up both doing some international human rights related work, but I also thought I might be interested in criminal law. So I ended up doing an internship at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, summer between my second and third years of law school, um, which was super fascinating. And I didn't think I wanted to be a prosecutor. I thought if I did criminal law, I might want to be a defense attorney. And so the prosecutors kept saying, well, so you want to be a prosecutor? And I was like, no, no, I think I want to be a defense attorney. And of course, they were like, no, no, you're so wrong. And I
Hmm.
was like, well, okay. But the good thing about this was that it made them really determined to explain to me why I was wrong, which meant that I had all these like incredibly generous people in this internship who were like, come with me to the crime scene, come with me to the trial, come with me to the meeting with the detectives.
Hmm.
And just being kind of I think I was probably frankly pretty useless as an intern because I didn't know anything. So every now and then I'd write some little memo for them or whatever. But mostly it was like getting to trail along with them to
Hmm.
crime scenes and trials and everything was fascinating. Um, and really, I think, stayed with me. And I ended up straight from that, going back from my final year of law school. The same boyfriend was who had brought me to law school. He was South African, and he wanted to go back to South Africa. And I thought, well, I should learn a little bit about South Africa, see if I, could imagine possibly living there. And I, cooked up this project to kind of give an excuse to go to South Africa, and you could get credit for sort of an internship in another country. And I decided I was going to write a sort of mini thesis on cultural change in the South African police. And this was the period when apartheid was just ending. And so you had this police force that had been a real instrument of repression, that, and yet was now, they were trying to think of, well, how do we take this police force that's been really repressive, and sort of maintain the power of white South Africans in the system that was by law intended to prevent Black South Africans from having equal opportunities. How do you take that police force if you're not going to have apartheid anymore, if you're going to say, no, we're not going to have this institutionalized official racism and discrimination, and make it one that's trusted by people and make it a better police department, which is, I mean, I think many police departments in the US face much sort of less severe versions of that. How do you gain trust if people associate you with bad stuff? And for South Africa, obviously, it was pretty extreme, right? This was apartheid was like, officially speaking, if you're Black, you can't live here, you can't have these jobs, you don't have full civil rights. So I ended up spending a lot of time in South Africa interviewing police officers and interviewing people about police officers. And again, sort of using the anthropology background, thinking about what's how do you understand the difference between rules, which are easy to change, and organizations that are easy to change their structure, versus an organizational culture, the kind of habits and assumptions and rituals, and that often people aren't even able to articulate to themselves, but that may make all the difference between how this police department operates, whether people are going to trust it, and so on. So that was pretty fascinating too.
Hmm. What did you find in terms of the officer interviews?
Tremendous variation that
Mhm.
I think one of the many lessons for me of everything I've done is that whatever you think you know about a group of people, you're probably wrong. That anytime you find yourself saying, well, South Africans are like this, or
Mhm.
cops are like that, or whatever, you're usually oversimplifying, because you have a group of people who are typically a lot more internally diverse than they may look from the outside. So, I met people who were totally racist, like just openly, in a way that you wouldn't get in this country. We're just like, well, yes, like, obviously we can't let the Black people do this. And I was like, oh my God,
Mhm.
but I also met people who were amazing, who were really, really thoughtful, including a lot of Black officers, who were super thoughtful about, we have, as a nation, we have done some terrible things, and this is going to be really hard, but let's think about, how we rebuild trust. Let's think about everything, not just from the level of, what new rules and policies do we need, but even on the level of things like, what do we call our sports team, right? Like, that can send a message to people.
Mhm.
Like, what do our uniforms look like? That can send a message to people, and people who are really thinking in a very, very kind of nuanced, serious way about, on every level, every single thing we do and say, everything about our uniforms, everything sends a message. And we want that message to be a message that says the new South African police force is committed to service and protection and respecting civil rights. Again, it's funny because I took me a long time to kind of circle back to policing after that
Mhm.
experience with the district attorney's office, and with writing about the South African police. But I had almost forgotten. I remember I finally was applying for the DC Metropolitan Police Department's Reserve Police Corps, and people were saying, "Well, why are you interested in this?" I'd almost forgotten those experiences. But then I was like, actually, I've always been sort of interested in this. I just ended up going in a different direction, but now I'm circling back to it.
Mhm. So, in terms of the different direction, so after you graduated from Yale, did you begin teaching immediately after that?
No,
No.
no, I didn't have any interest in being a professor. I
No.
didn't really know. I still didn't know what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
I was doing some consulting work for a human rights organization, Human Rights Watch,
Mm.
which had partly come out of that time in South Africa. I'd met some people who worked there, and so I was doing work for Human Rights Watch. I was teaching, but I was not teaching law. I was teaching a class on sort of the freshman writing class back at Harvard, just to get health insurance, basically.
Mhm.
It's not a tenure track fancy position. It's kind of a low paid freshman comp. So I was doing this consulting for Human Rights Watch and teaching this one class, and I was planning to go off and work for a big management consulting company in New York. and I had a job offer from them. I had deferred it for a year because I wasn't super enthusiastic about it. And sort of vaguely I think I was kind of hoping something better might come along. Um, and in fact, it did. One of my professors from law school called me up, and he ran the human rights program at Yale Law School, the International Human Rights Program. And he called me up and he said, my deputy in the human rights program is leaving. Would you have any interest in coming back and being my deputy? And I thought like, wow, that sounds so much more fun than helping a bunch of big companies get richer. That's so much more interesting. But I didn't see it as an academic job. I didn't see it like for me, like the fact that it was back at a university, I almost didn't quite register that. For me, it was a human rights job. It was an opportunity to keep doing human rights work and get paid more for it, have a real salary. And so I took it for that reason. But then, of course, I was back at a law school, and I was co-teaching with him the human rights clinic, and a clinical for people who aren't familiar with the terminology for law schools. Like a clinic is kind of like a practicum course. It's one where students actually do legal work or policy work under the supervision of professors. So it's not so much a kind of classroom academic thing. It's more project based. And so I was co-teaching that with him, and various people started saying to me, some of my other former professors, like, "Oh, look, here you are. You're like, you're back." And I was like, "Hi, I'm back. Yeah." And started saying, "Well, are you thinking of going into teaching? Are you thinking of trying to become a law professor?" And at first I was like, "Well, no, I'm not. I'm just doing this because it's sort of a human rights job. I'm supervising students to do human rights work. It's really not that different than if they were my, junior staff and I was a little bit further along than they were." But the more people started saying, "Well, you aren't you thinking of teaching?" By then I was in my late 20s and I knew I wanted to have children. And I was starting to think of things like, well, a lot of my friends were working for these giant law firms and they were making a ton of money, but they were working like, 16-hour days. And they were in kind of jobs where you never see your family.
Mhm.
And I knew I didn't want to do that. I knew I wanted to have children. I wanted to actually lay eyes on them from time to time. And so I was starting to think about, well, what can you do if you want to have kids, you want to have like a stable income. You don't want to just be a consultant or whatever. Um, and, hoping for the best. And I started thinking, well, maybe being a law professor would be a pretty good gig because you've got a steady income, you've got job security, but you have a lot of control over your time. And I ended up kicking around doing some government work and more human rights work for a while after that. But eventually I decided, yeah, maybe I will apply for law school teaching jobs. Um, and it was pretty much based on, it wasn't coming out of like a lifelong desire to be a law professor. It was very much coming out of, well, this seems like a really great way to have the time to do the other things that are interesting to me and have a family, and so I did.
Mhm. Would you start off teaching?
I started off teaching criminal law, uh,
Mhm.
and international human rights law, and over the years I've taught constitutional law, criminal procedure, lots of little seminars, often on sort of human rights related topics
Mhm.
and national security related topics. I started drifting more into the foreign policy and international affairs.
Mhm. Yeah, how'd you get involved, in that?
Through the human rights stuff,
Mhm.
because doing international human rights related work in other countries, and I ended up working at the U.S. Department of State for a while in their human rights bureau, and working in places like Kosovo and Sierra Leone, and that brought me into contact with people who did more general foreign policy work, and also brought me into contact with a lot of military personnel. Um,
Mhm.
and so I just started getting more interested in kind of the broader set of foreign policy and national security issues. And little by little, started drifting in that direction, both in my academic writing, but also in the kind of professional and extracurricular work I did, I guess you could say.
Hmm. And then are there parallels with the work that you were doing in human rights and on the international kind of side of things and national security with law enforcement?
A little bit. On the human rights stuff, I actually ended up working, in Kosovo, for instance. They're trying to have a Kosovar police force, and
Mhm.
how do you, again, how do you police in a this is a country in which, coming out of the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, you had Serbs, um, who were Christian. You had mostly Muslim Albanian Kosovars. You had Croats. You had people who had just been trying to kill each other, basically, in a really horrifically violent civil war that followed the kind of implosion of the former Yugoslavia. And there too, the U.S. was trying to help stand up a police force that would be multi-ethnic and viewed as fair. And so I did some work on that. I ended up going to work for the Defense Department for a while, and similarly doing a little bit of work related to trying to have a police force in Afghanistan that was viewed as fair and multi-ethnic and multi-tribal in Afghanistan.
Mm,
Um, so in some ways, thinking about policing in the international context was something that I kept coming back to on and off.
mm. Um, just want to talk about kind of what national security is. I know that it covers a broad range of issues, and was hoping that you could just define its scope a little bit,
It's
and kind of some of the challenges.
I mean, it's really hard to define because on some level, everything is national security, right? I mean, the traditional way to think about it is national security is issues like, how big is the US military? What are its capabilities? What can it do? How do we know what the Russians are up to? How do we know what the Chinese are up to? How do we make sure that international wars don't start? How do we protect shipping? International shipping, which is trade, really depends on shipping lanes being open. So you're not always getting attacked by pirates, or having some country say, if you come into these waters, we're gonna attack you. And how do you protect the United States from, whether it's terrorist attacks or attacked by other states? And that's the sort of traditional way of thinking about it. It's intelligence issues, it's military issues, but I think that as the world has become more and more interconnected because of the technological changes of the 20th century in particular, air flight, 1900, people weren't flying around on airplanes from country to country. It took you, if you wanted to cross to Europe, it was going to take you several weeks on a ship. Today, you can be in New York tonight and Paris in the morning. Um, and that has meant that, everything from potential transmission of epidemic diseases goes much faster, as we saw with COVID, right? To, things like climate change, that if you're polluting in China, that's going to have an impact on the climate in the United States, and vice versa. Um, um, Other technological changes, the internet means that information is sort of democratized. So if you're a terrorist and you want to figure out, how do I make a bomb? Well, you can look that up. It's really easy, right? It also means that it's easier to recruit, et cetera. And I mean, frankly, we're recording this at a moment when I think US national security policy is in some disarray. Um, but economic policy, trade policy, climate policy, these are national security now, because the globe is so interconnected, that you can't, you put tariffs on imports from some particular set of countries, that's going to affect everything from the value of the dollar to the global economy. It's going to make some people are going to be mad at you, which is going to make you more vulnerable in certain ways to potentially attacks and so on. And, if you even, I mean, even everything, right? That think about something like education policy here in the United States. Um, older listeners will remember, this is before my time too, but when the Russians launched Sputnik, their space program, and the US didn't really have a big space program. We were like, holy shit, they're way ahead of us. And we can't let the Russians control space for security reasons. And so that launched a huge US commitment to not just a space program, but to science and technology education, even at the elementary school and high school level, as well as at the college level, because we thought we need a population that can compete. Um, and if we want to maintain our scientific and technological edge, which is critical to space program, every weapons development, you name it, we need a population that is smart about science and technology. And so we have to invest in education. And the same is true today. And it sort of breaks my heart the degree to which we're underinvested in recent years in education. But in that very broad sense, there's sort of nothing that isn't related to national security. Even things, this just to give a slightly an example that I think still surprises a lot of people. One reason it's hard for our military to recruit because about 75% of eligible, 18 to 25-year-olds aren't in fact eligible, often because they're overweight, they're obese, and they can't pass the fitness tests. And well, why do we have so much obesity? Well, complicated issue, nutrition, education, how much do we regulate the use of hormones in cattle or whatever, right? So it's not there's one single cause, but if you have a bunch of policies that added together mean that 3/4 of young people can't join the military because they're not fit enough, that's a national security problem.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, I want to come back to national security, but I feel like I've skipped around a little bit. So I want to track how you got to Georgetown.
You sure you
From
don't want to talk about policing?
I do actually, I do. I'm leading up to the your role as a reserve officer, and so I want to get from Yale to Georgetown. How did that happen?
Oh, Yale Law School. I then went and worked at the State Department, and then I was working for some philanthropic foundations and consulting. And Georgetown, well, I didn't start at Georgetown. I went on what's called the teaching market. When you apply for academic jobs as a law professor, you apply to lots of different schools. And the place where I got an offer was actually University of Virginia Law School. And I took that offer, and I taught at the University of Virginia for 5 years, but because I was doing a lot of national security, foreign policy stuff, you really want to be in DC, Washington, DC. I mean, that's where the government is. And being in central Virginia and having, a 3-hour drive every time I wanted to get to DC was sort of tough. I actually loved the University of Virginia. But certain point, I knew people who taught at Georgetown, and they when I got a job offer from Georgetown, I thought it just made a lot of sense for me to go there.
Mhm. So um, when you were starting at Georgetown, you also working on the kind of national security side, as well as criminal law. Were they similar courses that you were teaching before at the other universities, or did they change in some way?
They're
Yeah.
constantly changing, I guess.
Mhm. So where did I know you had said previously that you had been interested in law enforcement while you were in law school, and that you kind of came around back to it later. What was it that kind of sparked that interest again?
Um, Good question. I'd always been interested in, I suppose you could say, the relationship between law and violence, the ways in which we use law to try to control violence, both by private actors, regular people, and by government actors, whether it's the military or police departments. I'd always been interested. I'd written about that in my kind of academic scholarship. And I had worked at the Defense Department for a while and had written a lot about the law of armed conflict, the law of war, basically. And then I left the Defense Department, and by coincidence, I'd actually learned about this Reserve Police Officer program in DC, from a woman who had worked for the government. She literally got, she mentioned it kind of in passing at some, federal government stupid executive training thing that they made me do, and I didn't wanna go to it. I was like, "This is stupid. I don't wanna go to this dumb thing," and this
Mhm.
woman was talking, and she said kind of in passing during this training thing, she's like, "Yeah, I was a reserve police officer in DC." And I was like, "No way. Like, you can just, like, volunteer to be a police officer? You're kidding. That's so weird." And, it kinda stayed with me, and when I first heard about it, my kids were still pretty little, and the I looked into it just
Mhm.
enough to decide that the time commitment really wouldn't be possible at that stage, but, I always kind of had it in the back of my mind, and, a few years later, when my kids were a little older and I had a sabbatical, I had some time off from teaching, I thought, "Well, why not? It'd be kind of fascinating." And I think for many people, um, as with the military, and my husband is a army officer now, he's now retired, but as with the military, a lot of people who aren't part of it see it feels very opaque, like it feels like this very closed culture that's hard to learn about. And I think policing is similar, that for people, if you aren't a police officer, you don't have immediate family, close friends who are, it can feel like this very intimidating, closed universe. And um, the fact that there was this reserve police program where anybody, anybody over 21 with at least 60 college credits, et cetera, but, you could apply and go through the police academy, and in DC, the program, you don't get paid, but you have all the powers of any sworn officer. It's not just like directing traffic, you're armed, you're sworn, you have arrest powers. I just thought that's so fascinating. It'd be so interesting, to learn more about this and to sort of see what policing looks like from the inside rather than from the outside.
And so, while you were there, and maybe you learned this before, or maybe during your time as a reserve officer, but some of the issues that you described from within national security, and that enveloping many different things, do you see an impact on that within law enforcement? Do you see officers' role changing as some of those issues grow in different ways?
Um, yes, and I think one of the big challenges for police officers, as for the US military, right, is that, as I said, like on some level, everything is national security, which means that on some level, everything is a job for the military. And one of the things that I think happened with the military, especially in the last 25 years after the September 11th terrorist attacks, is the military started being asked to do more and more things, that literally it's like vaccination programs for cattle in Botswana, and,
Mhm.
let's have rock concerts in Myanmar and whatever. And a lot of military people were like, "Does this really make sense? Like, I'm not trained to do this." And I do think we see something very parallel has gone on in policing, and for parallel reasons. Part of the reason the military ended up doing all that is we were underfunding the civilian parts of US foreign policy, State Department, USAID, which barely exists anymore as we record, right? And so whenever the US government decided it was in the US interest to do some, cultural, economic thing, they kind of look around, they go, "Well, who's here? Who's got money? Oh, it's the military. Let's have them do it." And I think parallel for police, we as a society have kind of underinvested in education and healthcare, and mental health and, economic development and job training. And the result is that when you look around in a lot of American cities, like the police are the only institution standing. And they're sure the only institution that you can call 24/7
Mhm.
and say, "Get here now." And as with the military, like, the police will get there now. And normally, most people work 9 to 5 or whatever, and, like, you can't call them at 3 in the morning and say, "We need you here this minute." Police will. And
Mhm.
so many around the country, I think we started looking to police to essentially do all kinds of jobs that didn't really have a whole lot to do with crime prevention or solving crimes. And that has created all kinds of strains for police officers and all kinds of sort of weird contradictions within the system.
Did within the military, did have they found ways to bring in other resources so that the um, those members of the military that were asked to do more than what they were, initially thought? Um, I guess my question, I guess, looking at the parallel between the two, and some of what um, we'll talk about later, like the alternative first responder programs, right? Like, were they thinking about options like that within the military? Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous line when former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, who was both a four-star general, as a Marine general, and then President Donald Trump in his first term made him Secretary of Defense. He had famously said, while testifying before Congress, he actually testified on behalf of increasing the budgets for the civilian foreign policy agencies like the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development. And what he told Congress when he testified was, hey, if you don't want to fund state and USAID, you're going to have to buy me more bullets. Um, because he saw very clearly that those sort of soft programs, the humanitarian assistance and so on, and technical assistance and economic development assistance, they help prevent conflicts. Um, and if you don't want to end up being in wars, you need to invest in preventing conflicts, but the military is probably not the right institution to be doing that stuff. And so he was really clear, like, you underinvest in that sort of so-called soft power stuff, you're going to end up with more conflicts, and you're going to need to use your military more in war, which I don't think most people want, right? And I think it's something the military has really struggled with. I'm frankly appalled by what's happening right now. I think it's the Trump administration, second Trump administration, choosing to really just essentially dismantle that part of the US government, USAID and the Foreign Services ability to have that kind of program. It's incredibly short-sighted, because then as now, that's the kind of program that keeps us out of wars. Funding those kinds of everything from the sort of cultural exchange programs to, earthquake disaster assistance programs, or preventing Ebola outbreaks in Africa. Americans might say, well, what does that have to do with us? Why should we spend money on that? Because we're interconnected. Somebody gets Ebola in Africa, guess what? Somebody's going to get on a plane and end up coming here, and somebody here is going to start getting Ebola, right? And we've seen it over and over and over. If you don't invest, it's about investing in prevention. It's about investing in conflict prevention, disease prevention, et cetera, et cetera. You don't do that, we're all going to pay the price. It's going to be a much more dangerous world where we're going to need our military much more. So to me, it's just unbelievably short-sighted that the current administration is dismantling those programs, just as short-sighted as, I mean, the parallel with policing is very obvious one. The irony of all those, like, defund the police stuff, right? The irony is that if you change the conversation, if you say to a cop, like, hey, we want to defund the police, they're like, are you nuts, right? Like, are you out of your mind? I'm working like double shifts because we don't have enough manpower. Have you seen my car? It's a piece of crap. I'm working these terrible conditions. I don't have the resources I need. And now you want to take money away, right? But if you ask a really different question, if you say to the same police officer, tell me about the stuff that you do that you don't think you should be doing, because you don't think you're good at it, or you don't think you're effective at it, or you think it diverts you from the stuff that you really need to do. And then that same police officer is like, oh, please, yes. Like, I spend so much of my time, like, trying to deal with somebody who really needs mental health assistance, but there is none. So I have to do it. I spend so much of my time dealing with some troubled kid. The schools are failing this kid, and I end up encountering them over and over, and they end up going into the juvenile justice system. Why the hell aren't the schools there for this kid? That you underfund that other stuff, you're going to overwhelm police. And you're going to end up having police officers who have to do all these things that they're not trained to do, they're not particularly good at, they don't want to be doing, which is less time for them to be doing what they are good at and do want to be doing, which is preventing and responding to crime. So it's just, you can't have it both ways, right? If you want, whether it's the military or police, if you want them to be able to focus on their core mission and do a good job of it, you've got to fund the stuff around it that makes that possible. And when we start, if we're not putting enough funding into job creation, into healthcare, into mental health, into education, into mentoring programs for kids, the inevitable result is that police officers get asked to do all sorts of stuff that they don't want to do and nobody else really wants to do either, right? And those are situations where you then end up having these real tragedies, often that have to do with officers who are exhausted and overwhelmed, doing things they're not really trained to do in ways that sometimes aren't good for communities.
Well, let's jump into your role at the Metropolitan Police Department as a reserve officer. What was it that motivated you to become a reserve officer?
You know, I was a little bored. I had a sabbatical. I messed up the timing. You're supposed to use a sabbatical if you're a professor to, work on a big writing project, but I sort of messed up the timing. I had just finished a book. And so then I had this sabbatical and I wasn't really ready. I didn't have a big new writing project. But I had a semester completely off without teaching and had to figure out, well, what am I going to do? And I had heard about the Metropolitan Police Department's reserve officer program, some years earlier, and had always been kind of curious and just fascinated that this program even existed. It just seemed like such a amazing and unusual program, that anybody could, not anybody, but almost anybody could volunteer, and go through the police academy and work as a police officer. Um, so I'd always been fascinated by it, but when I'd first learned about it, my children were still young, and for reservists, the commitment, because most reservists have jobs, is it's several evenings a week, and all day Saturday for at least 6 months, and I just, when my kids were little, I thought, I can't do that. I can't be away 3 nights a week and every Saturday. And but finally, by the time the sabbatical came along, my kids were adolescents. They had their own stuff to do. They didn't need me around every single second. Um, and I just thought, well, I've got nothing else to do. I've got some free time. When else would I do something like this? It seems kind of crazy, but I don't just want to be sitting around doing nothing. And because I'd always been I'd always been fascinated. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. I've been sort of fascinated by the relationship between law and violence and the ways in which the law is used, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully, to try to control and constrain and channel and give meaning to different kinds of violence. And I had worked on issues relating to policing in other countries. I had worked on issues relating to the US military. And so in some ways, given that policing is, among other things, sometimes very violent in this country, and this is back in 2016 that I started in the Reserve Corps. But then, as more recently, there were big debates about why policing is so violent in the U.S. Why do so many people get killed in interactions with police? Is that a problem with policing? Does that reflect a broader problem in American society, like too many guns or too much crime, whatever? What is going on with that? What is the role of law in changing that? You lawyers, law professors always think, well, if we change the law, we'll change people's behavior. Um, that's not always true, or sometimes their behavior changes in ways that you didn't predict when the law changes. So if you think, well, gee, wouldn't it be better if there was less violence related to policing? It's not always a super simple question of, well, is that just a matter of different laws? But so I was always interested in that cluster of questions. And so then when I found myself with time on my hands, um, it just seemed like, I'm just really curious. I want to go see what this is like. And at first, honestly, I didn't I didn't really know if I'd really do it. I thought, well, I'll apply, and I probably won't really do it. And then I applied to the Reserve Corps, which is not an easy thing to do. It's just like applying to be a full-time law enforcement officer. You have to go through a zillion background checks and medical checks and psychological testing and drug testing and everything under the sun, and takes a while. Um, and so then when I had done that and I got accepted, um, even though I'd initially thought, well, maybe I'm just not really going to do this. By then I'd put so much time into this. I thought, well, I should at least go to the police academy and see what it's like. And then of course, by the time I graduated from the police academy, 6 or so months later, um, and I had gone in thinking, well, I probably won't really be a police officer. That would be crazy. But then I thought, well, I would just spent 6 months learning to be a police officer, and so I'll just give it a try and see what it's like. And there you go. So anyway, I stayed in for almost 5 years.
What was the the application process like? What were some of those steps?
Probably pretty similar to most departments around the country. And anybody who's ever applied for a security clearance or a federal government job, you had to fill out 1 million forms listing every address you'd had in the last decade, and
Mm,
where you went to school and where you worked and names of references at each of those places. So it's a lot of scrounging around trying to think, wait, what was my address, when I lived there? Or
right.
what was the name of my boss back in that job, and your family members, and whether you'd ever had any arrests or any drug use and so forth. And you had to you had to take a battery, several hours worth of psychological tests to try to weed out the blatant sociopaths. You had to get medical screenings, take drug tests, be certified to be physically fit. You had to, as a threshold matter, you had to pass a really basic sort of physical test at the police academy, where you sort of ran an obstacle course and things like that. um Not too demanding, but I think the idea was just, better to find out early if there's
Mhm,
just, you have no hope of being able to do this, um rather than invest a lot of time before you find that out. You have to have a home visit from some officers, have to come to your house and
mm, wow.
interview your neighbors and so on. So it's a lengthy process.
Mm,
And it depending on in MPD, I think they've sped it up since then. I mean, at the
mhm,
time, it took 4 or 5 months to go through that process minimum, sometimes longer. I think they've sped it up a little bit since then.
mhm. And was it what you expected?
It's a little worse than I expected. I mean, I have held in the past high level security clearances, working at the Pentagon, and the MPD process was more cumbersome and intrusive than
Hmm,
the process for getting a top secret,
mm,
sensitive compartmentalized information clearance at the Pentagon, which is kind of mind blowing.
wow.
And
And
you,
so what was the 6 months like? What was it that you all were being trained in and you specifically? And was there any difference between what the reserve officers were being taught versus full-time officers?
In terms of content, no. I mean, we had exactly the same curriculum, all the same course materials and curricular blocks. And sometimes we were in the same classrooms mixed together with the full-time recruits for certain things like firearms training and emergency vehicle operations, and a lot of the emergency medical related stuff. Um, because those were things that they only did during business hours. Um, but I think the biggest difference, we had probably a slightly more laid back
Hmm.
academy experience, a little bit less spit and polish and get into formation,
Hmm.
because we had a smaller group. It was the evenings. Not all, but many of our instructors were themselves former reserve officers, and they tended to be not. There were exceptions, but they tended to be a little bit more laid back. And the reserve class was quite different than the average career recruit class, mainly because on average a lot older. The career recruit classes, I don't know the average age, it was probably 25, 26 years old.
Mm,
um, there were people as young as 21, the minimum age in MPD. But they tended to be younger people, whereas for the reserve classes, I think the oldest person in our reserve class was in his mid or late 50s when we started. And we did
Hmm.
have some folks who were quite young in their 20s, but probably the average age for us was mid 40s. And
Hmm.
I think of the 16 of us, 11 or 12 were current or former military, and two or three had prior law enforcement experience. We had a guy who had been an MPD, New York City Police Department officer, for instance, and who'd moved to
Hmm.
DC and didn't want to be a police officer full time anymore, but wanted to do it part time. And so I think just the fact that you you had an older group with more professional experience, tended to make the instructors be a little bit more relaxed with us.
Hmm.
In terms of content, um, it was the same curriculum, and so it was everything from substantive issues of what is the law in Washington D.C., which is
Hmm.
needless to say sometimes mind-numbingly boring.
Hmm.
You had to memorize lists of, what is a misdemeanor for which an arrest can be made, what is a misdemeanor for which you can't do an arrest, you have to do a citation, um, handcuffing techniques, the, 9 different forms you needed to fill out for different types of property and what color pen you needed to use to fill them out. Yes, they were kind of obsessed with that.
Wow.
Um, whether the abbreviation for the days of the week should be, 2-letter abbreviation or a 4-letter abbreviation. Or did you need to spell out the entire, I mean, some of it was just mind-numbingly boring. But also all the tactical stuff, defensive tactics and officer safety issues. The thing I think that to me was most there's a little bit of the history of Washington, D.C., the history of policing in D.C., but the thing I found most frustrating in its relative absence from the curriculum, the thing that wasn't there, um, we really didn't talk at all, officially speaking, about things like, well, what is policing for? And what is good policing? And how do we know it when we've got it? Which actually seem like really crucial questions, even for
Hmm.
line level patrol officers, how do you know if you're doing a good job? What does it mean to be doing a good job? Is and this is a really big question, right? Like, is good policing when you're making a lot of arrests? Is good policing
Hmm.
when you're making fewer arrests? Is good
Hmm.
policing when crime is down? Well, are we totally sure that crime going up and down is really related to changing in policing tactics? Does the number of police officers matter? Does where they are matter? Does how they police matter? That all these really crucial things, like that any occupation, you
Hmm.
kind of want to know, like, what does it mean to do a good job? How do you know when you're doing it? Were not things we really talked about, and that seemed like a huge, huge gap.
Hmm. So, how did your academic background influence kind of how you were approaching that? And was that kind of how you were thinking of some of those questions throughout the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think just being an academic and having worked in different but sort of related worlds, adjacent to the military, or worked overseas and looked at policing issues elsewhere, where partly because you're often sort of starting from scratch, right? Like in Kosovo and the Balkans, after the conflict, they're trying to set up a multi-ethnic police department. And so inevitably there are a lot of conversations about, well, what do we want police to do here? Like, why?
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
should this look like? What do they need to know? What should they do? How are we going to know if it's working? And maybe I think, when you're slotting into a system that's been there for a long time, people stop asking those questions.
Hmm.
It's kind of unhealthy. You should always be asking those questions periodically. Like, you can't ask
Hmm.
them every day or you'll never actually get anything done. But every so often you want to take a step back and say, okay, what are we doing? Why did we think this is a good idea? Do we still think this is a good idea? So that, yeah, I think coming at it with a habit of asking those questions. But I also, I think I told you I had done this anthropology master's degree before law school, and I think that also very much affected how I go into experiences like that. That
Mhm.
part of me, because I'm kind of a busybody, wanted to always be saying, "Hey, we ought to do this differently." But there was another part of me saying, "Shut up, sit down."
Mhm.
Nobody really would have appreciated that.
Mhm.
But to just kind of say, slow down, you know, try to understand this world and why the things people do are things that make sense to them. Um, Usually. I mean, sometimes there are things where you're like, "Why do you all do this?" And everybody's like, "We have no idea."
Mhm.
Usually people are doing things because they think it makes sense. And it does make sense in some, at least within some system that you may not understand yet. And so the trick when you're new at something is to kind of on the one hand have a little bit of a split personality. You want one part of your brain to still be always asking those questions that will, like, why, or that doesn't make any sense, why not do it differently? But you want another part of your brain to kind of go into patient learning mode and just be saying, okay, maybe there's something here I don't get, and I need to just watch people and listen and learn and begin to understand why, to the people who set this system up, this actually does make sense. Because only when you can understand that, do those other set of questions, only then can you kind of answer them in a more interesting and useful way.
Mhm. So did, the experience challenge some of, your preconceptions of law enforcement?
Um, yeah, although there at the beginning, you're just drinking from the fire hose, and
Mhm.
everything is new, and but I mean, I think, you realize right away, any culture you go into, you realize right away that whatever assumptions you had, a lot of them are going to turn out to be wrong. And that any stereotypes you had, you'll meet a few people who conform to them, but you're also going to meet a lot of people who don't. And so in some sense, right, like that no longer surprises me anymore. I mean, this is advantage of getting old, right? That I've gone into enough situations in my life where every single time, my expectations are a little bit confounded, which means that now whenever my expectations are not usually all that firm when I jump into a situation.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, there were both things that surprised me in really positive ways and in some negative ways. I mean, the positive things, again, I don't want to overstate the surprise because I don't think I went in with sort of strong stereotypes, but
Mhm.
but you know, that there are lots of really thoughtful people. There are lots of people who are really quite idealistic and really caring and really thoughtful, who think hard about policing and spend a lot of their time trying to think about how should I do this right, even if it wasn't part of the formal curriculum. There's still
Mhm.
people, because humans are humans, and you can give them a dumb curriculum, and smart people are still going to be asking smart questions,
Mhm.
no matter what. You can't shut that down. That's what people do. And so meeting a lot of people who were just really thinking hard about all the issues they should have been thinking about. How do we do this right? What does it mean to do it right? Am I doing it right? Should I be doing this at all? Am I asking the right questions? Can we change how we do this? And that was a really, nice surprise to see so many people who really were struggling with it in a kind of really healthy, constructive way,
Mhm.
on the inside. Um, the thing that was sort of a negative surprise, as I said, was that we didn't talk about why are we doing this and what's it all for. And in fact, on top of that, that there were certain ways in which there were some pretty negative kind of habits of mind sort of baked into the curriculum, and one of them in particular, and something I've talked about a lot, both in the book I wrote about policing, but whenever I talk about it, um, I think we really had drummed into us, both in ways both formal through the formal curriculum and informally through the kind of conversations instructors would have outside of the classroom and recruits would have outside the classroom, that policing is this incredibly dangerous occupation, and that sort of everybody is potentially a lethal threat to police officers all the time. And, you know, that's one of those things where it's both like true and totally false at the same time, right? I mean, it's true in a sort of literal sense that of course you never know. Any police officer going into any encounter, you can never be 100% sure that there's not some lethal threat lurking in any situation. You go buy a bunch of Girl Scout cookies, right? And there could be one of the Girl Scouts is a serial killer in disguise, right? It could happen. And inside the box of Girl Scout cookies is their, machine gun and whatever. Like that could happen. And every now and then it does, and it happens just often, not the actual Girl Scouts. I don't want to malign the Girl Scouts, but I mean, there was a much more mundane case, much more typical. Shortly before I started at the police academy in DC, there was in a neighboring Virginia jurisdiction, there was a young officer on her first day out of the police academy. She was with her training officers, and they got called to a domestic violence situation. And I don't know all the details of exactly how it unfolded, just what was in the news, but they walk up to this house and the door opens and a guy with a gun is standing there, and she starts firing, and she's killed, and the two other officers were wounded. And that happens, right? I mean, it does. Police officers do get killed in the line of duty. And so, on some level, it makes sense, and it would be irresponsible for police training not to talk about tactical safety and talk about, I mean, I don't want to make assumptions about this particular situation because I don't know the details, but is there something they could have done differently would have minimized that threat? Should they have had more backup? Should they have gotten more information before they went? Should they have approached the house from a different angle? Who knows? I don't know whether maybe there's just nothing they could have done. Maybe there was, but it's certainly, those are conversations that it's really important for officers to have. And we spend a lot of time at the academy having those kinds of conversations and talking about things like, okay, you've got a call. You don't know the details of this situation. Should you screech up with your sirens and lights on, right in front of the house and go running towards the front door? Maybe not a good idea, because you don't know what's in that house. Maybe you want to park down the block. You want to approach quietly. You want to see if you can come at an angle, peek in the window before you go to the front door. Just try to make sure you understand what situation you're getting into so that you don't end up in some kind of ambush situation or a situation that just escalates out of control. And that's obviously the kind of conversation, you do spend a lot of time appropriately in the police academy talking about those kinds of things, tactics and safety. But here's the downside, right? If you overdo it, if you get to the point where you assume that the Girl Scouts might pull out a gun any second, boy, does it make people trigger happy, right?
Mhm.
Then next time you walk up to a bunch of Girl Scouts, instead of saying, hey there, what kind of cookies do you have today?
Mhm.
You're jumpy, your hands on your gun, you're about to yell at anybody, you're about to pull your weapon the second anybody reaches into a bag. And best case, you're going to be really unpleasant and nobody's going to like you and nobody's going to feel like, wow, that was a nice encounter with our local police. I feel very trusting. Worst
Mhm.
case, somebody's going to reach into their bag and you're going to shoot them and they're going to be dead, because you were paranoid and jumpy. And and I think that there was just so much at the academy that kind of fostered that second, more paranoid perspective. We'd spend time kind of watching these YouTube videos of officers being killed in various horrific ways, and then talking about them sort of in the name of officer safety, of like, we'll analyze that. But I think that we didn't spend much time talking about, well, let's talk about statistically, right?
Mhm.
How often do officers get killed? How great is the threat? Compare that to other kinds of threats. Compare that to what are the goals of policing, again, which we didn't really talk about, right? But let's assume that we want people to trust us, and how do you balance the fact that, of course, you want to keep officers safe, but you also want to keep community members safe, right? You don't want officers to be safe at the expense of a bunch of dead Girl Scouts or something, right?
Mhm.
In fact, police are trained, they're paid. If somebody makes a mistake and somebody ends up getting hurt, it seems ethically like it would be better to have the trained paid person rather than the Girl Scout. Obviously I'm exaggerating there for effect. It's not always Girl Scouts, but and we didn't really talk about that. So how do you get that balance right?
Mhm.
How do you both learn to take appropriate precautions and be
Mhm.
paranoid enough that you're not being an idiot and just walking into dangerous situations totally oblivious all the time, but
Mhm.
not so paranoid that you get jumpy and a lot of innocent people end up dead because you were scared. And when you look at situations in which people get killed by the police, unarmed people, which happens much too often in this country. Almost always it comes down to an officer being scared, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and an officer having a split second in which do I trust or do I err on the side of paranoia? And they're scared and they shoot first and they ask questions later. And that's not a great place to be. And I think it is possible to train people to do a lot better, but I don't think many police departments do a great job with that.
Mm-hmm. So, so this was when you started, was almost 10 years ago. Do you see
Eight
examples
years
of,
ago, exactly 8 years ago. In fact, 8 years ago, as of I think Wednesday.
wow. Have you seen departments kind of starting to incorporate some of these questions, or, are, um, agencies talking about this balance that you describe?
Yeah, although I worry that the current political climate's going to dial that back, but I think in a very healthy way. Yeah, we have seen more of that, and in particular, I think we've seen several things. You know, one is pioneered by people like the amazing Sue Rahr, um, longtime police chief and sheriff in many places, especially in Washington State. You know, she wrote a really important article. It's called something like "Guardians or Police Guardians or Warriors," and she talked about the
Mhm.
difference between having a warrior mindset and having a guardian mindset, and the importance for police having a guardian mindset. And in the work that she'd done in Washington State, where she, for a while, for instance, she ran the police training programs throughout the state, um, she really emphasized lots and lots of physical training, of defensive tactics training, because one of her arguments was that thing about fear, was that police are more likely to pull out their gun if they're scared that they can't handle themselves physically. That,
Mm-hmm.
that, that an officer who's scared they're going to get beaten up, um, they think, well, I better pull out my gun. Whereas an officer who feels physically self-confident feels like I can handle it. You know, if this person starts punching me, I can handle that. No problem. I don't need to pull out a lethal weapon in order to
Mm-hmm.
handle it. So she's
Mm-hmm.
very much not in a kind of, well, just, roll over and let them attack you. She's in a confident officer who's got really good training, doesn't pull their gun, unless it really is life and death, because they've got other skills, and they also really emphasize verbal skills, de-escalation skills, how do you handle things so that people will feel heard and so on? How do you go into a situation, calm it down, so that people feel respected, that you can deal with whatever the dispute is, et cetera. And I think the work she did and others really, really sparked a lot of departments to think really hard about things like that in a really healthy way. I think another thing that happened was really emphasizing, and these are very related, pushing officers to think out of the split second framework, right? And this is sort of interesting legally too, right? When you get these cases where, still relatively rare, where police officers are charged with homicide for killing somebody, um, the focus legally has tended to be on, well, in that split second moment where the officer had to decide whether to pull the trigger or not, would a reasonable officer have perceived a lethal threat, potentially lethal threat, and pulled the trigger? Um, but the trouble is, the answer to that is almost always yes, right? Because any of us can put ourselves in a situation where, okay, all of a sudden there's somebody who could be a really scary, murderous somebody, and we think they might have a gun, and they're reaching for something, and it's dark, and they're pulling it out of their pocket, and split second, is it reasonable to think it might be a gun? I might need to shoot in self-defense. Yeah, most of it, okay. The problem with that is that it takes your attention away from what happened 5 seconds before that, what happened 10 seconds before that, what happened 5 minutes before that. And when you start doing that, you often get a really different set of questions about what alternatives the officer had. So you get a situation like, oh gosh, one of the real tragedies, so many tragedies, but particular tragedy since it involved a child, the killing of Tamir Rice in, I think it was Cleveland, and this was in, I think, 2015. Um, um, Police, the dispatcher received a 911 call saying that somebody was waving a gun around in a park, and there were all, and so the officers are called, they get to the scene, they come screeching up, they see a large figure with what looks like a gun. They come screeching up, he turns towards them, they shoot him, he's dead. Oops, it's a 12-year-old kid and it's a toy gun. Not good, right? Horrible. The obvious question, you go, well, in that split second, there you are, you're crouched next to your car, you see this large figure with a gun turning towards you. Do you shoot or not shoot in the split second? Is it reasonable to shoot? Well, that seems reasonable. But then you ask yourself a different set of questions. You say, wait a second, a whole lot of things went wrong in this story, starting with, for instance, the dispatcher did not tell the officers that the caller said, I think it might be a kid and it might not be a real gun. So crucial piece of information is missing that could have been conveyed. That's obviously not the officer's fault, although it's, something's wrong in the system that doesn't get through. But the officers, why'd they go screeching up right next to him, right? They could have stopped the car 2 blocks away, right? They could have come along slowly. They could have taken cover. They could have used a loudspeaker to communicate with him from a position of cover, where even if he was a man with a gun and he spun around, he still couldn't hurt them, right? And they're all I've heard people say different things, including everything up to, well, they slipped on some ice and they got closer than they meant to. What maybe I don't feel like I can make a definitive judgment on this without knowing a lot more than I do. But I think that to turning the focus away from the split second to, okay, you've got to report that there might be somebody with a gun in a park. That could be all kinds of stuff. It could be really dangerous. It could be nothing. How are you going to approach that so that if it's really dangerous, you're safe, but if it's nothing, you don't accidentally end up killing a kid? And that's a whole different set of questions, right? And so not just from a legal liability perspective, but from the perspective of training, I do think that kind of issue pushed a lot of departments to really get their officers to sort of think not just about how do you avoid getting into a situation where you're going to have to make a split-second decision in a potentially life or death setting. Like, that's the question. And that's really, really emphasizing, and this is actually something I thought that the MPD training did a good job. We had a sort of tactical village, sort of mock village for role play training, and really emphasizing your job when you go into a situation is to buy yourself time distance. Because you do not want to be the person who goes rushing in and you're already, your heart rate's through the roof, adrenaline's spiking, your hands are shaking, you've just rushed up, and now all of a sudden it's total chaos. You haven't given yourself any time to kind of go, okay, what's happening here? And really emphasizing that whenever humanly possible, and sometimes it's not, but when humanly possible, what you want to do is you want to create time to make decisions and distance so you're safe. You want to find cover. You want to give yourself you want to put yourself in a position where instead you can observe. And obviously you can't always do it, right? I mean, if this was like a active shooter and he's actively shooting, you can't just sit around and kind of go, let me think about this for a bit. That doesn't end well either, right? But here's a situation, nobody's actually being hurt. No, it's not like there are a whole bunch of little shrieking preschool kids sitting around being menaced with a gun. Nobody's being hurt. How do you go into that situation to create that time and distance so you can evaluate what's happening, what can I do? And that's a situation that didn't have to end in tragedy. And I think that's something that I do think a lot of departments have gotten better at, really getting officers to focus on that set of prior questions before the split second.
Were the trainings that you received compatible with like what you experienced in the field? Like, when you were on your first assignment, did you feel well prepared, or were there things that you had to kind of improvise or adapt differently?
Well, there's always, there's no possible way any training could prepare you for the kind of the full range of what you'll experience. I think the idea training should give you enough basic tools that you can improvise in ways that work. And overall, I thought the training was, in that sense, pretty good. Despite the despite the flaws in the curriculum itself, we had some really good instructors. And I think that, I mean, I think it's true with any level, whether it's, high school or college or police academy, or, that a good teacher makes a difference. A good teacher can make a bad, boring subject amazing, and a bad teacher can make a good one horrible. And we had some really good instructors who um, I think were really good at sort of talking you through, here, how should you think about these things. But still, yeah, I mean, field training always comes as a surprise. You're dealing with, live humans. You're not dealing with abstractions on a page, or instructors who are role playing or something.
How did you feel the community responded to you? Did you enjoy being out in the field, and were people receptive?
For the most part, they were. And I was assigned to the 7th district in MPD, which, for those familiar with the DC area, is the southern part of Anacostia. And it's historically been probably the district in DC, police district, with the most serious crime, the most homicides, et cetera. Very, very poor. And although I had a lot of people tell me, oh, everybody hates the police, I can count on the fingers of one hand the times that anybody said anything
Mm,
or behaved in a way that was sort of overtly hostile.
mm,
It really, even in a community, and which is not to say there wasn't anger about policing, some of it justified, but by and large, you know, most of the time you're showing up because somebody called you. Somebody wanted you to
mhm,
be there, which doesn't
mhm,
mean everybody wants you to be there, but you're showing up because somebody called 911 and said, help, please send the police. And when you get
mhm,
there, oh, officer, thank goodness you're here.
mhm,
Um, and I think there's hostility to police, but most of the hostility is not to police as such. It's there are neighborhoods and communities that have had a lot of bad policing, and they don't tend to want no policing. They tend to want better policing. They
mm.
want respectful policing. They want effective policing. And sometimes nobody's really asked them, from your point of view, what does that actually look like? But yeah, overall, I didn't. I mean, yeah, every now and then a bunch of teenagers would shout something as you went by or whatever.
Mhm,
But it really
mhm.
wasn't a big deal.
Yeah. Um, so let's talk about where the Center for Innovations in Community Safety kind of comes in. Was it while you were um, so so you talked about going on sabbatical. Was that just for the training period? And then while
Yeah.
you were as a reserve officer, were you teaching?
Yep. Yep. I guess I went back to teaching. I guess I graduated from the police academy. I was teaching while I was, right, yeah, I was teaching. And some point while I was still in the academy, some of the questions that we've talked about, one of the things that I was very lucky. Um, I said we had some great instructors, and one of those was a young guy. I think you may be interviewing him in another one of your podcasts, Ben Heyman.
Oh yeah, Ben. He's part of the series.
Right. So Ben was a reserve police officer himself in MPD. He had uh, started the department as an intern when he was in college. But he's a very capable, smart guy. He'd risen rapidly. He was special assistant to the chief by the time. In his civilian role, he was special assistant to the chief and a reserve officer when I first met him. And Ben is somebody who's really thoughtful and interesting about policing, and has got a real, problem solving attitude. And
Hmm.
so some of the issues that I was just talking about, I'd say to Ben, hey Ben, I feel like we don't talk about this enough, and I don't feel like we don't talk about that enough. And Ben would kind of go, yeah, that's a good point. And at a certain point, I went to Ben and said, these questions like, well, what is good policing? How do we know if we've got it? Um, those are questions that it seems to me recruits are really interested in talking about, but the
Hmm.
academy curriculum doesn't give you space to do that. And
Hmm.
wouldn't it be great to create some kind of program that created more of a space for police officers, recruits, police officers, to talk about those issues, to talk to people who are critical of them in a space that wasn't hostile, and just to kind of like, let's have a conversation. You think this, I think the opposite. Can we like talk about this?
Mhm.
Um, and Ben said, I think that's an interesting idea. Let me run it by the chief. Um, and that led to the creation of a fellowship program for young MPD officers, ended up being called the Police for Tomorrow program. And at a certain point, I said, I teach at Georgetown. What if we hosted this at Georgetown? I think I've got some other colleagues who teach about criminal law and procedure and policing, who would be great resources. And Ben said, okay, let's do that. And it took a while to get it all off the ground, but we started this fellowship program, um, sort of thinking of it as like hard questions in policing. Um,
Mhm. Hmm.
and several of my Georgetown colleagues got involved, um, and then that then expanded. And at a certain point, we realized, well, we've this program, we got that program, we're thinking about this. Let's call it a center.
Mhm.
And that was the sort of birth of the Center for Innovations in Community Safety, which now runs a wide range of police reform, police transformation programs.
Mhm. So from the very beginning, it was, MPD and you, Georgetown, your colleagues really working to build this together.
Yeah, yeah, and over the years we've been really lucky because we've had a really strong relationship with MPD, and we've had a series of chiefs uh, uh, who have been super supportive, um,
Mhm.
and who've been really open to saying, "Hey, Leah, why not? Let's give that a try," and putting some time into it and staff time and so on
Mhm.
to make them successful. Not all of our programs are with MPD anymore. We have several that are much broader than that.
Mhm.
Um, but that was definitely a feature of our programs from the beginning, and it makes sense. I mean, we're the law school in Washington, D.C. This is our local police department. We wanted to make sure that we weren't just sort of sitting at Georgetown talking about policing issues nationally and ignoring our own
Mhm.
front yard.
Mhm. Yeah. Was the university kind of behind it from the beginning?
Absolutely. No, the
Yeah.
university was great, and we got a little bit of seed money from the
Mhm.
dean, and the whenever we would graduate our fellows, we've had, I think, 4 cohorts of fellows since then. Both the dean and the chief of police would come and hand out the certificates, and is
Mhm.
really, I think the university saw it as a, community activity that was important for having good relationships with important actors within the community.
Mhm. So can you just describe the kind of fellowship program a little bit? How's it integrated into the university? Do they come for classes or do you guys just kind of meet regularly? What's the experience
Yeah,
like
it's
for the
pretty low
officers?
key. I mean, as I've said, we've done 4 cohorts of fellows, so each group has had, 12 to 20 fellows in it. There tend to be young officers. They have to apply. They have to write little essays of, why they want to be in the program. And the
Mhm.
program, they meet every few weeks, often but not always in a seminar room at Georgetown Law. We also have had some off-site things. We've taken them elsewhere to have discussions, um, and we it's sort of like a college class in the sense that we'll give them articles to read, and we'll often have guest speakers come in, and the guest speakers, sometimes they're scholars, sometimes they're high school kids from the neighborhood,
Mm.
or people who advocates for the homeless or whatever, maybe whatever the issue is, will um and each session is usually 3 to 4 hours long, and they can get pretty intense, talking about how police handle adolescence, or talking about those issues of the use of force, or race in policing, or mental illness in policing. um, so they can get pretty intense. But it's been overall, it's a really good experience. I think for the fellows and for us. I mean, I've learned a lot from talking to our fellows, and I think they learned a lot, and several of them have gone on to, do really well within the department. And it's good
Mhm.
to know that these people who are just really smart, thoughtful people are out there.
Mhm. What is the center looking at nationally? What are some of the issues that you all are
Well,
tackling?
our a whole bunch of things, but our one of our signature initiatives, for which we're probably best known nationally, is the ABLE program. And that's ABLE stands for Active Bystandership in Law Enforcement. And um, the idea of the program is that when you get these terrible situations like the death of George Floyd, right? And you've got Officer Derek Chauvin who's kneeling on his neck, and he suffocates to death. And you think, well, he was kneeling on him for like, I forget what it was, 7 minutes, 9 minutes. It was
Mhm.
a long time. It wasn't like 30 seconds.
Mhm.
And George Floyd's dying. And this is over the most trivial thing, right? It's over the question of, did he possibly have counterfeit money that he was paying for something in the store? And why is this level of force being used? Why is this guy going to die over this? And how come nobody's saying, wait, what are you doing?
Mhm.
Why is nobody stopping this? And saying, this is crazy, let that guy up. And and in fact, if a couple of the other officers there um made kind of feeble attempts to do that. One of the rookie officers sort of like, well, maybe we should let him up. And Derek Chauvin's like, no, we're good. And the guy's like, okay, and that guy's now, not only is Chauvin in prison, but the rookie who didn't stop it is also in
Mhm.
prison, because most states have a duty to intervene. That if you're a police officer and your partner, your colleague, you see them doing something illegal that's hurting somebody, you have a legal duty to intervene and stop it if you can. You're not supposed to just stand there with your hands in your pockets going like, oh, gee, this doesn't seem right, but I guess I'll just stand here, right? But the problem is, and as we all know, I mean, everybody remembers from being a kid, peer pressure is super powerful. It's really hard to intervene effectively, right? If your peers are like, no, what's the matter with you? I got this, or a superior officer, it's really hard. People are bad at it. People, even when they feel uncomfortable, and think of people's behavior with a bully, even when everybody's thinking, oh, this is terrible, people don't want to get involved. They don't want to draw the bully's attention, or they don't want to look like a goody goody. And
Mhm.
and and so the ABLE project, active bystandership, um, is premised on the idea that learning how to intervene, to be an active bystander, not a passive bystander, just put the hands in the pockets, is something that actually can be taught and learned and practiced and perfected, just like any other skill.
Mhm.
Just like you can get better at putting on handcuffs fast or drawing your weapon and firing accurately. And the way you do that is you practice. You
Mhm.
don't just think about it a lot, you do it a lot.
Mhm.
So the ABLE program, basically, it's a lot of role play exercises where we put people in situations where something's going wrong. And sometimes the something might be an officer who's committing an abuse, like Derek Chauvin. Other times it might be a safety violation, like an
Mhm.
officer didn't properly search somebody before cuffing them, and now they're sitting in the back seat of the police car and they might have a knife in their pocket that they can reach for. And you saw your partner didn't really do a good search. Are you going to say something? Or are you
Mhm.
just going to be like, oh, I don't want to embarrass him, so I guess I won't. And then somebody could end up getting hurt.
Mhm.
Or it might even be an officer who's struggling, they're drinking too much, or they're clearly having mental health issues of some sort. And do you say something? Do you not say something? And so the program really puts officers in situations where you're practicing over and over, and you're learning that if you try to intervene the first time, you're probably going to get brushed off, just like that rookie did with Derek Chauvin.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, back off. I've got this. Um, but we teach them that, yeah, you're going to get rebuffed.
Mhm.
That's not the end. That means you go to step two. Your
Mhm.
first step is, hey, maybe we should let him up. Step two is, we need to let him up. Step three is you grab him and you pull him and you say, no more, stop. And you use force, even, if you have to. And and as I said, it's not just all around police bad behavior. Sometimes it's around safety and, officer wellness and mental health, but really trying to think very concretely about how do you give somebody the skills so that if they're in a situation, whether it's, boy, my partner's, I think he might be drunk. Do I say something? Or I don't think my partner did a real search and that person could still be armed, or whether it's, oh, my partner's shouting at that person and being pretty rough. Should I say something? That we want officers who have the skills to intervene effectively and cool things down, get get help if it's needed, stop something bad from happening. And that's a program that I think, you know, is probably our signature program at KICS. We call it the Center for Innovation and Community Safety. Um, more than a quarter of all the law enforcement agencies in the country now are part of the ABLE program and use our training programs. Um, and I think it makes a difference. Just having officers who are thinking in an active way about, what do I do? Do I stand here and do nothing while this bad thing is happening? And if you don't know, if you've never really thought about it before, odds are you're going to stand there and do nothing. But if you're thinking always and often, okay, how do I jump in here and keep the bad thing from happening? You're a
Mhm.
lot more likely to do it.
Mhm. Um, is it unusual for universities to create a program? And I know it's a version of the program that began in New Orleans. Is that right? Um,
Yeah, yeah, on just a smaller citywide scale. Yep.
mhm. So is it for a university to adopt a program like that and roll that out throughout law enforcement? Is that um, do other universities do
Um,
things like that, or?
yeah, yes and no. I mean, there are some really terrific university-based programs on policing. NYU's got a great one, for instance.
Mhm,
Um, Many of which will work with law enforcement um, on innovative programs. So it's not unknown. There aren't as many as you might think there ought to be. In
mhm,
fact, that's something that is really, I think, still missing in the policing field. That there aren't, and this is very different from the military. There aren't like a zillion think tanks and organizations that really focus on trying to understand policing and how do you make it
mhm,
better, and university programs. There are some, but there
mhm,
aren't that many. And in fact, this is a fascinating issue in and of itself. And it's one that Ben Heyman, who I mentioned earlier, thinks a lot about. In a lot of other countries, you want to become a police officer, you basically go to college to do it. You're doing like a 3-year
mm,
program. Um,
mm,
in a university type setting where you're still learning all those tactical skills, but it's a little bit more like going to West Point or the Naval Academy.
mhm,
Um,
right.
you're not just doing 12 weeks or 24 weeks of part-time stuff. It's a really much more immersive. And in the US, for all kinds of complicated historical reasons that Ben can explain better than I can, that's not how police training and education evolved. It became more like the same way you become a plumber, or a truck driver, you do a short course. You're not going to
Mhm,
school for it for a few years. But in most other countries, most European countries, for instance, you're spending 2 or 3 years in a kind of quasi undergraduate degree program setting. And so thinking about policing is also much more tightly linked to
mhm,
academic environments. And
mhm,
that didn't happen in the US. You just don't have that kind of academic backbone that would make sense, and a lot of professions do have, where you just have this sort of constant feedback loop between people out there on the streets doing the work and people who are thinking about it and teaching about it and writing about it. So I think more would be good.
mhm. So, reflecting on your experiences as a law professor and reserve police officer, and as well as an author, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about your book, Tangled Up in Blue. But what are the insights that you have gained in terms of the legal frameworks that exist within policing, and then kind of on the ground, actual having to do the job?
Um, I think one of the insights, and this is a humbling insight for a law professor, any lawyer, is that the law often matters less than we think it does, or at least it matters in really different ways. I mean, and I'll give you an example. Um, I teach criminal procedure to law students, and so I teach them things like about the Fourth Amendment's exclusionary rule, right? No unreasonable search and seizure, and everybody's seen this in movies or TV. That evidence gets thrown out, right? Because like the police didn't Mirandize somebody or whatever.
Mhm.
The police obtain the evidence in an unlawful way, so the evidence is going to get thrown out, which means the person's not going to get convicted. Maybe a guilty person goes free. The evidence gets excluded. And you would think it makes total sense intuitively to think, oh, because there's a legal rule that says that if you didn't follow these procedures to obtain the evidence will be thrown out, that would give ordinary police officers a really strong reason to abide by those rules. Because if you're a police officer, you don't want to have somebody you arrested who you think is guilty get off because you screwed up. That makes total sense, right? And it's a complete assumption of most law students, lawyers, that that's the way it works, right? Problem is, one thing I found, at least in MPD, and I think different departments are different, ordinary officers usually didn't find out what happened to the case. They'd arrest somebody, that'd be the last they
Mm.
saw. They didn't necessarily know. Did that person get tried and convicted and their evidence just wasn't needed, so they didn't have to testify? Or did the case get dismissed and never went forward at all because the prosecutor said, clearly this police officer violated the rules and this evidence would get thrown out, so I'm not even going to bother to take it forward? They don't find that out.
Mm.
And if you don't find that out, if you don't even know, then that link, that logical link between your thinking, well, I wouldn't want this evidence to get through, it's going to be broken. On top of that, if you're a patrol officer, you don't get promoted based on how many of the people you arrested get convicted. Like nobody's tracking that. You're going to get promoted based on a whole bunch of other things. So it's basically irrelevant to you.
Mm.
So here's this law that we think is going to make a difference in the behavior of police officers, but it just doesn't, for various reasons that you wouldn't necessarily understand if you don't have more familiarity with kind of the day-to-day work and thinking of ordinary line officers. That doesn't mean that law can't make a difference. It just means that a lot of the laws that we assume, well, obviously, like that should, this is the effect this is going to have. It doesn't work. So that was one of the big insights I took away. And in fact, I think, overall, although there's lots of ways in which I came away from these years thinking, boy, police departments should do things differently. They should do things better. There are lots of things police chiefs and police departments can do differently and better. It also really left me thinking there are so many ways in which most of what you ask an average person, like, well, what's wrong with policing? And they'll give you all these criticisms. Most of those things have nothing to do with the police, right? Mostly what they're saying things like, oh, they arrest people for stupid stuff they shouldn't bother making arrests for. And you say, okay, you know who wrote those laws that made those arrestable offenses? It wasn't the police, right?
Mhm.
It was legislators, whether at the
Mhm.
state level or city council level. And you know where those people came from? Well, guess what? You voted for them.
Mhm.
And you know why they do that? Because crime went up and a whole bunch of people started screaming and calling the mayor and saying, do something, do something. And
Mhm.
maybe they did some dumb stuff. And that's not the police who created that system. That's us, right?
Mhm.
And really kind of thinking about the fact that police don't operate in a vacuum. They're doing what we tell them to do, basically. That
Mhm.
it's other actors who are creating both the legal framework and the sort of organizational framework in which they've got to work. How many officers, how much you're getting paid, and all these things, all these little things.
Mhm.
It really made me very keenly aware of that there's a lot about policing that can't be fixed by police.
Mhm.
you know, and there's some things that can be, but there's a whole lot that if we don't like it, that's sort of on the rest of us. It's on the lawyers, it's on the prosecutors, it's on the judges, it's on the elected officials, it's on the voters to change. It's not something cops can change by themselves. I think the only other thing I'd say, you know, we're we're at a moment where I think politically speaking, at the national level, there's a little bit of a backlash against some of the police reform efforts. And I was never a defund the police person. Um, and some of the reform efforts were maybe not the smartest way to go about stuff, and there's a bit of a backlash against it now, which I actually think is a real shame, because I think those are super important conversations to have happen. Even things like defund the police. I think that was wrong-headed in the way it got framed, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. There's a piece of that conversation that's incredibly important, and where you find police having common ground with their critics. And that's that set of questions about things like, well, does it make sense for police to be doing this? Maybe the police don't want to be doing, critics don't want them to do it, and the police don't want to be doing it, but there's nobody else to do it. Well, what would it mean to create a somebody else? If you think police shouldn't be dealing with mental illness, well, what would you have to fund? If you're a city, a community, a state, what group of people would you want to have with training who are paid to deal with this? And what skills would they have? What systems would you need to set up? Those are incredibly important questions, and shutting them down just, as a kind of a backlash of like, well, no, now people aren't tough enough or something. To me, that's just dumb. And it's a real tragedy, because I think we were moving in some really healthy directions, and in some much more nuanced directions, where within cities, there were starting to be some much healthier conversations about, okay, maybe the answer isn't no police or spend less on police. Maybe the answer is slightly different police and a whole bunch of other different things. And how do we talk about that in a way that's really constructive, that gets the whole community to where we all want to go? And breaks my heart to see those conversations getting shut down.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rosa. This has been a really great conversation, super insightful, and I really appreciate you taking all the time to share so much about your career and what you're doing and the work on behalf of law enforcement in
Pleasure.
Georgetown.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you so much.
thanks so much for inviting me on.
We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. The Icon series is not just about contemporary figures in the law enforcement community, but about all those who have served their communities and the world, from now and in the past. Be sure to tune back in with us for future Icons episodes to learn about key figures in American law enforcement history. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.